It's a pleasure to see Rabbi Ari, Rabbi Dr. Ari Zivotofsky, who I don't think we have seen since we've been in India together a couple years ago. He led our India trip, and he's a professor of neuroscience at Bar-Ilan University. And of course, he's very famous for all his halachic adventures. He writes, of course, in every issue of Jewish Action on some interesting point of halakha that people misunderstand. And he's very involved in researching kosher animals and all kinds of interesting tidbits. And it's a pleasure to have him and talking on soft matzah, sort of an issue. I imagine most of us online have probably never eaten soft matzah, but I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, Vakasha.
Okay.
If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat box. And then when it's over, when you finish the lecture, we can have people, unmute themselves and ask questions in person if they would like to.
Right. Although I think if there are things not clear in the middle, you could, I guess I have the chat on, so if people could send the chat. That's how we've been doing it in class.
Yeah.
So, okay. Welcome, everybody. Although the topic is soft matzah, before I start with soft matzah, I just want to give a little, some thoughts that I had about the Pesach and where we are today. Pesach, I don't know if we have anybody from Israel online here, but in Israel, in university, there's a concept of moed bet. You get a second chance. You take your exam, you don't like your grade, you get a second chance. What's interesting is that Pesach or Korban Pesach is the only mitzvah in the Torah for which there's a moed bet. We actually have a second chance. If you weren't able to do Korban Pesach in Nisan, you have a second chance in Iyar. As the Torah tells us in Bamidbar Tet, people came to Moshe, they complained, they said, Vayhi anashim asher tmeim lenefesh adam v'lo yachlu la'asot ha'pesach b'yom hahu v'yikrevu lifnei Moshe v'lifnei Aaron b'yom hahu v'yomru anashim ha'im. The people came to Moshe and they complained, why should we not be able to offer the korban? And Moshe didn't have an answer. He went and he asked God, and God said, Dabel b'nei Yisrael le'emor, and he gives them the halacha of Pesach Sheni. So God says, you have a second chance. And indeed, that's how it was throughout the time of the Beis Hamikdash. People who, because of they were tamei or far away and couldn't bring the korban, had a second chance. All the way to the extent that in Divrei Hayomim Bet Perek Lamed, we read what seems to be that the entire nation brought a Pesach Sheni. The Gemara discusses what that really means. Doesn't mean they did Pesach Sheni or they did something else, but simple reading seems they made Pesach in a year, meaning Pesach Sheni. We'll get back to that in 1 second. I just want to say that I don't know how it is in Canada or the US. Here in Israel, we're pretty much locked in the houses. But this is not the first Pesach in which Jews are locked in the house for the Seder. As a matter of fact, the very first Pesach, the Jews were locked in the house for the Seder. As the Torah tells us in Shmos Yud Bet, Chof Bet, that Moshe gave them instructions, Lo teitzei ish mipetach beiso ad boker. You weren't allowed to leave the house all night of the Seder. So the very first Pesach and this Pesach share a lot in common. More than that, why couldn't they leave their house? Well, Rashi tells us. Rashi says, when there's a plague, in that case it wasn't a plague, it was the punishment of the firstborn, meaning when there's a plague in the streets, nobody should feel safe. You can't think that my learning, my prayers, whatever it is, will keep me safe. If there's a plague, we have to stay in the house. So very interesting. So what I just want to end off in my starting message here is that we're all going to be, or most of us, are locked in the house for the Seder. We're having a very small Seder. Very often it's just the nuclear family without the grandparents or grandparents without the grandkids. A very unusual event, which of course is resulting probably in more Storim taking place this Pesach than any other time in history. But we can also look forward to Mirz Hashem, if the plague calms down, that on Pesach Sheni, maybe we could have a second chance. Pesach Sheni this year, on a month from now, Yud Dalet Iyar, April 8th, Friday, Maybe we'll even bring the Korban Pesach. And if not, at least maybe we could all get together with extended family and have a second chance to have that Seder that we're not going to have this week. Okay. With that message, now I want to go on to the topic of soft matzah. I think, unlike what Rabbi Jay said, I think today many people have heard of soft matzah. Many people have even tasted soft matzah. It's something that's become really in the last few years. I know in Israel, they're selling it now in the supermarkets, in the freezer section, and you can buy soft matzah made at various factories, various bakeries, different ashkachas, and it's become very popular for people to want to try. And although the title that I think we gave this was something like the history of soft matzah, really it should be the history of hard matzah. Because as we'll see, soft, thick matzah was probably more the original, and the thin, hard matzah that we eat today, or at least Ashkenazim eat today, is probably the later innovation. So what I want to really look at is when and why that changed, and at the very end, I guess, a little bit about what some of the poskim have said about Ashkenazim using thick, soft matzah. And I'm going to sort of be interchanging between the thick and soft, but really there are two variables between Ashkenazi and Sephardi matzah. One of them is the hard versus soft, meaning our Ashkenazi matzah is those thin, hard crackers, while Sephardi matzah is more like pita. And the other difference is the thickness. Ashkenazi matzah is very thin, while Sephardi matzah is thicker, and it's become even a hiddur, even an advantage. There are bakeries that sell matzah today. You could see on it that it says, with all of the chumras, with all of the hidurim, thinner and thinner. So just like pizza shops nowadays try to sell thinner and thinner pizza, so the matzah they're making is thinner and thinner matzah. So there are two variables really. We're going to talk about thick versus thin and hard versus soft. Now, the real problem we're going to have is that there's no description of matzah. Matzah is really the only mitzvah from the Torah that we have nowadays on Pesach. It's the only mitzvah of something that we have to eat. And yet, the Torah never describes to us what matzah is, what the ingredients of matzah are, how you make matzah, what the steps are. There's no discussion of that anywhere in the Torah. Worse than that, there's no description, essentially, in the Gemara, in the Rishonim, because there was no need to give a description. Everybody knew what matzah was. Throughout history, every family or every small group made their own matzah. So there was really no need for anybody to describe what matzah looked like. Everybody knew what matzah looked like, and everybody knew how to bake matzah. So if we're interested in knowing what the matzah was like, let's say, in Germany in the 12th century, or what matzah was like in the time of the Talmud, we're really going to have to try to find the hints, or try to find references to other halachas that will shed light on what the matzah looked like. So when I discuss this with people informally, so usually I say, anybody have any clue? Anybody, could you give me some mitzvah, something that has to do with matzah that will tell us if the matzah in the Talmudic period was thick or thin, hard or soft? And usually there's one proof that people come up with right away. Jay didn't want interruptions, but Jay, if anybody has any suggestion, something that we to this day do at the Seder, which is mentioned in the Gemara, which might give us an indication if the matzah was hard or soft.
Yachatz.
Korach.
Korach. Who said Korach?
The sandwich. Yeah, Korach.
Yes, the sandwich, Korach, right? Many people say Korach seems to be a very good indication, because that is a Korach matzah umar b'yachad, and that sounds like a laffa sandwich. It sounds like you would take a laffa, you would take a soft type of bread, you wrap it around the korban pesach, around the meat, you put in the lettuce, you put in the maror, and you have really a laffa. And that would seem to indicate that that the matzah that they were discussing in the Talmudic period was soft, was more laffa or pita-like rather than cracker-like. The only problem with that is, well, there are two issues with the what I call the Korach proof. One is that not everybody agrees that the matzah surrounded the maror in the sandwich. There are actually Rishonim who understood it the other way, that you wrap the matzah with the maror. So it's the leaves that are doing the wrapping. The second thing is, it's not clear that the word korach indicates something that's soft, something you could wrap around. The shorish, the root of the word korach, means to surround, not to wrap. So, for example, we just finished Purim, and we know that in Purim you have a Purim of the unwalled cities and Purim of the walled cities. And a walled city is called a krach, from the same root as korach, because it's surrounded by a wall. Now that wall is not pliable, it's not a soft wall, but it surrounds it. Or the binding of a book is a kricha, because it surrounds it. So korach, although on first reading it looks like would be a proof that they used soft matzah, on second glance it's not really such a strong proof, because it could be they took two hard matzahs and put the maror in between and put the meat in between, and you have a sandwich where you have the maror surrounding the other elements. And again, korach might just mean surround. Okay, so that's usually the first thing that people mention. So what I'd like to do now is look at a few other sources. Jay, if I could just share. Let's see if it works here. No, not yet. Okay.
Should work now.
Yep, we're putting it up. Okay. So what I'd like to do, we have a lot of sources I'd like to go through. And the thing is, hold on, can I move it? Yes. Okay. So the first proof that I would like to bring from the Gemara that might tell us something about their matzah was what I call the moldy bread proof. There's a halacha in the Gemara, which I'm going to skip the Gemara, we'll go right to the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch quotes it more or less verbatim. And the Shulchan Aruch talks about a problem which most housewives today would find unthinkable. The Shulchan Aruch says, Matzah pat b'Pesach b'beito. You find bread in your house on Pesach, ve'eino yodeya im hu chometz u'matzah. And you don't know if this bread is chometz or matzah. The Shulchan Aruch tells us, mutar, you're allowed to eat it. Afilu ba'achili, it's not only mutar b'hana, not only could you benefit from it, you could even eat it. Why? Das lina bata basa, we follow the latest. And what's the latest thing that you brought into your house? Was obviously matzah, not chometz. So the first thing we learned from this halacha is that their chometz bread and their matzah looked indistinguishable. Because today, in a normal Ashkenazi house, this would obviously not be a question. If you find a piece of challah, you know that it's chometz. If you find a matzah, it's most likely kosher Pesach. What the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch is talking about here is obviously a time period where bread and matzah look the same. But it's more than that. The Gemara then says, the halacha v'im hu mu'upash harbe, if it's very moldy, if it's so moldy that, let's say we're talking the 5th day of Pesach, and you found this piece of bread, and you don't know if it's bread or matzah, and it's on the 5th day of Pesach, and it's so moldy that it couldn't have possibly gotten that moldy in just 5 days, well, it's obviously from before Pesach, and it's obviously chametz. That shows us that they're talking about, well, as the Mishnah Berurah says on this, din zehu minich zmanam. This halacha is only according to what they used to do back then. Shahayu ofim matzot aveh. They used to bake thick matzah, ktsat, aveh ktsat, a little bit thick. V'lo yechulukim b'taram mikikar shel chametz. So the Mishnah Berurah says this halacha doesn't really have any bearing today. It's talking about when they baked slightly thick matzahs, and they were indistinguishable from chametz. But it's more than that. Not only is it indistinguishable, but it's of the type which can get moldy. Our bread, our matzah today, you could leave it as long as you want. The chance of it getting moldy, certainly in a week, and even in several months, are pretty slim. So it's talking about that they made some sort of matzah that must have been soft. It must have been pita-like. It was a little bit thick, as the Mishnah Berurah says, and it had the potential to get moldy. And the Aruch HaShulchan just elaborates a little bit more on that. He says, matzah pas b'Pesach b'beito. You find bread in the house on Pesach, and you don't know if it's chametz or matzah. Shedomin lamatzah mutter afilu b'achila. Okay, the imapat humu upash harbe. If it's very moldy, she'ef shabatokim b'Pesach itapesh kol kach harehu vade chametz. The im over, and this is amazing. The im over mimei Pesach shenuchad litlot shenitapesh mishnichnas Pesach. Let's say we're talking day 5, and you find this questionable bread, and it's a little bit moldy, and notice they still want to eat it. They wanted to eat this little bit moldy bread. And he says, how much is it moldy? Well, it's a little bit moldy that it could have become moldy on Pesach. Im ate slow, nogim la'afot bePesach pat chama b'chol yom. Told him the hakel. He says, what would happen? You'd have your bread basket, you throw in your matzah. You bake new matzah the next day, you throw in that hot matzah on top of it. So what happens is the b'chol yom afa pat cham v'nosno alav. So if you put hot bread on top of your bread from the day before, so there's a chance now that that could cause it to get moldy. So he says, obviously they were baking fresh, they were making it soft, and it therefore had the potential to get moldy, and it might still be that it's kosher Pesach. Okay, so from here, what do we see? Again, no description in the halacha of matzah, but really we learn a lot about their matzah. It was thicker, it was indistinguishable from chometz bread. They baked daily, and it was soft so that it can become moldy. Okay, the next proof is what I call the isaron proof. And isaron is a measure of volume. It's equal to 43.2 eggs, about 1,200 grams. That's the minimum that you need to take challah. So I don't know what that is in pounds, but it's how much when people bake and they take off challah from the dough that they're baking. The Rosh tells us, the Torah tells us, quoting his father, the Rosh, says, Adoni Avi Rosh Zal, because of the Nogim Ashkenazi v'Tzafat. What's important here, the history is that the Rosh moved from Germany to Spain in the 1200s. So he's sort of sharing with us the customs from Germany and France, and he knew the customs in Spain. He says it was the custom in Germany and France, la'asot mi'isaron zechel lachmei toda. They would make their three matzahs, right? We have three matzahs at the Seder, and then the goal is to give out from those three matzahs that are in front of the house here, in front of the guy running the Seder, to give out to everybody else at the Seder. So the Rosh says that their custom was to make those three matzahs from one isaron. Now, what you have to keep in mind is today we often buy, I don't remember anymore what size boxes you buy in America with matzah. Here, when we buy hand matzah, we buy a box with a kilo, and a kilo of matzah has in it about 15 matzahs. What the Rosh is saying is they would use 1.2 kilo of flour to make just three matzahs, which means if their matzahs were the thickness of the matzahs that I'm buying today in Israel, each of their matzahs would have to have the surface area of about 5 of the matzahs that I'm buying. Massive. So big that you couldn't put it into an oven, which means that they obviously weren't making it as thin as we make it today. They were making it much thicker, which also explains some of the other halachas. The first of all, Shulchan quotes the two of Seder Isaron, and the Mishnah Berurah says that Ayin b'seifim beit meyesh mefakbek al minhag uvekama mekomot kayom nishtaka haminhag. So interesting. The Mishnah Berurah, writing in the mid-19th century, says that in some places this custom is no longer observed. What that is telling us is that in many places it was still observed, which means that in the mid-19th century there were places that were making 3 matzahs from any isaron. So even mid-19th century, in the heart of Ashkenaz, in the heart of Poland, they're making matzahs that are at least 5 times as thick as the matzahs that we're buying here in Israel today. So again, I don't know if they're hard or soft. We're not able to deduce that from this, but from this halacha, it's clear that they were making much thicker matzahs. And that also explains one of the instructions that we have in the Haggadah. Most people in their Haggadah, it says that the person running the Seder breaks the middle matzah for yachatz. And it now has 2.5 matzahs left. And then when it comes to motzi matzah, we wash, we make the bracha on the matzah, and then the instructions in the Haggadah are that the person leading the Seder gives a kazayit to each person from the matzah. Well, that can't be. If you look at all of those instruction booklets that they give out in the schools today, it says that a kazayit is about 2/3 of a hand matzah. So how are you giving everybody at the table a kazayit from your matzah? But if we now understand that until not so long ago, their matzahs had 5 times as much flour in them. Each matzah was 5 times as thick as we have today. Now you could understand how they were giving each person, because that means instead of 2/3, each matzah was 2/15. Each kazayit was 2/15 of a matzah. And Moshe Feinstein was quite astute. He noticed this, and he said, "V'imkein b'leilei Pesach sha'af ha'gimel matzot sherov ha'olam nogim ze yoter mi'meir shanim shlinyan ze ichshuri dari v'osim matzos dakot." Yes, today we do better. He likes that we have very thin matzahs. Sha'af im heim matzot gedolot lo yaspeak, even if they're very big, but because they're so thin, there's no way you can give out a kazayit to everybody. It was dakek lechol kazayit matzah. Ela l'shnayim. He says, even if you have a big matzah today, they're so thin, at most you can get 2 kazayits out of a matzah. V'nimtza shalosh shai chlal hagim matzah. It just doesn't work. 3 matzahs. Ela l'balabayit u'lishto. The person running the Seder and his wife. Maybe you can get a kazayit out of the matzah. So how are you going to give out to everybody a kazayit? He says, Ella yistadru she'ela kol echad mehazacharim lechem mishnah miyuchad. Every male at the Seder should have his own 3 matzahs. Vim nit barech gam bebanot, and if he's lucky and he has many daughters, tiyem b'tzuref echad min habanim, each girl to one of the boys. Vim kulam banot, if he has a lot of girls, yiten gam ken l'chol shtei banot, he should give each 2 girls shein yoter miyud b'shana that are over bat mitzvah, gimel matzah b'fnei, meaning every 2 girls should have their own 3 matzahs, because otherwise there's no way that they're going to be able to have a kazayit matzah. And the girls and boys have to eat matzah. And he says, V'chei nog, and I love the quotes here, Adoni Avi Mori Hagon Rav David, he says, this is what my father did. My father gave each 2 people, boy or girl, their own 3 matzahs. V'chei anino hei kol hashanam, and that's what I do. Umakavani shagam benai yinogukach. Again, and I hope that my children will do similarly. So first, I think it's beautiful how you see within the Seder, he talks about the transmission of traditions. His father did this, he does it, and he hopes his children do it. But for our topic, the topic of matzah, it's clear that what he's saying is there isn't enough in each matzah to give out, because we have what he views as a worthwhile chumrah of having super thin matzahs. But he says it's only Zeh Yoter Mimesh, 100 years we've been doing that. And as we saw in the Mishnah Berurah, in his time, in the mid-19th century, there were still places that were doing 3 matzahs from an isaron, meaning very thick matzahs. Now, what I didn't get into, and we need to talk a little about for the next proof, is the difference in making of soft versus hard matzah. Because matzah would seem really simple. How could we have different types of matzah? All of matzah has the same ingredients, flour and water, and nothing else. Okay, some Yemenites actually add salt, but other than that, there's no variety. For all of history, in all of the different golios, Jews had flour and water in their matzah. So how could it be that you have thick and thin, and you have soft and hard? How do you make different types of matzah? So the essential difference, well, first of all, even the Gemara talks, I don't think I brought it on the source sheet, I may have it at the end. The Gemara talks about that not all ovens are the same, and not all wood is the same, and not all women are the same. Meaning it depends who the women are who are doing the kneading, it depends what kind of wood you're using to heat the oven, and it depends on what the oven is made of. So every matzah will come out a little bit different. But today, the essential difference between soft matzah and hard matzah is simply the ratio of flour to water, how wet the batter is. In a typical Ashkenazi hand factory, it'll be about 1 to 1/2, meaning a kilo of flour to about 480 milliliters of water. So it's a little under 1 to 2, 1 to 1/2. In a machine factory, they'll have even less water. It's even drier. So it's a kilo to 300 or 400 milliliters of water. In a soft factory, in a Sephardi factory, it gets almost 1 to 1. They use a little bit more flour. It could be 1.1, 1.2 kilo, and they'll use about 1 liter of water. So the big difference is how wet the batter is. Well, now that we understand that, let's see what the Shulchan Aruch tells us about how wet their batters were. We don't take challah when we make, usually you take challah, you separate the part that would be given to the Kohen from the dough before you bake it. So when people make challah at home for Shabbos, You'll make a big batch of dough. You'll separate the challah. You'll keep that separate, and then you bake the chalot in the oven. With matzah, we always use smaller batters so that we don't have enough to be obligated in separating challah. So what you do is after you bake several rounds, several naglas of matzah, you put them all together and you separate challah from the finished product. The Shulchan Aruch discusses this business of taking challah. And he says, we don't want to have a big batter of challah because then it's harder to knead and to avoid chimutz. There's mutav shiamayit, but you want to have a smaller batter. Lechein tov lekarev ha'isod yachad b'shat hafrashat challah she'yashiku zu b'zu. He envisions multiple people kneading small dough at one time. And he says these multiple people should put their dough near each other so that they touch each other. Maybe one of them doesn't have the requisite amount. So we put all the batter together. They're all touching. They all become like one large batter after you've kneaded them separately. And now you could separate challah. The Mishnah Berurah says, what does that mean? Which if I would pull them apart, one would pull a little bit dough from the other, meaning they're literally stuck together. But he says, if you do a very dry batter, he says if you use a really dry batter, like we use, like the Ashkenazim use, you can't do this. You can't stick them together because they won't stick together so that you could pull apart. So again, what's clear is the Shulchan Aruch didn't occur to him that you would have this exceedingly dry batter. He doesn't mention, and if you can't do it like that, if you can't stick them, it doesn't enter his mind. Shulchan Aruch just says, you have wet batter, you can stick it together and join them. Mishnah Berurah recognizes that in his time, mid-19th century, you have two types of batter. You have the type of batter described by the Shulchan Aruch, and you have the type of batter that he's becoming familiar with, where it's too dry in order to stick it together. Okay, so how thick should we not make it? So now we have the not too thick proof. Shulchan Aruch says, let's not make it too thick. What does that mean? Ein osin bepesach pat aveh tefach. On Pesach, we don't make matzah a tefach thick. Now, how big is a tefach? A tefach is like this, okay? So he's telling you to avoid making it several inches thick. You don't have to warn somebody in a bakery today not to make it a tefach thick. It gets nowhere near that. I mean, our matzahs are millimeters, not like this. So obviously, in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, early 16th century, people were making matzahs that were thick. How thick, we don't know. But it must have been that it sometimes approached the tefach, or there'd be no need to say that. And not only that, the Magen Avram, who was Ashkenazi, 16th century, nearly the B'diavad Mutar, says if you would make it that thick, it's okay. As long as you were careful that it didn't become chametz, you can actually make it that thick. But they started making thinner. The Pri Megadim then quotes from the Beit Hillel, B'Shem Beit Hillel, Yoredeh, Tzor Ka'ovi Etzpa, Dahainu Rochav Agodal, Dahainu B'Matzah She'oshen L'Tochlam. Okay, and this is a few very important points he makes. We're now talking Ashkenaz, 18th century. And what is the Beit Hillel telling us? The Beit Hillel was actually a little before, but it's Ashkenaz. He says you shouldn't make them thicker than an etzba. An etzba meaning the thickness of the thumb. So we now got from a tefach in the time of the Shulchan Aruch to the thickness of a thumb in the time of the Beit Hillel. And he then added a very strange comment, which we're going to get back to. These are for the matzot that you're going to grind. That indicates two things. It indicates that there must have been two types of matzahs, because we have matzahs that were grinding, and if we have matzahs we're grinding, we have matzahs we're not grinding. So we're going to see that there were two types of matzah at that time, and the matzahs that were grinding were making thicker, he says. And the Mishnah Berurah over there also points out the kshi aveh kol kach, when you make it thick, thicker than a finger, thicker than whatever it is, there's yesh lachush Shema lo yishlot choma eish b'tocha. What's the concern, the Mishnah Berurah says? And this is what has led to the thinner and thinner matzos today. He says, if you make it thick, we're concerned that maybe the fire won't be able to affect the dough that's in the middle, and it won't cook it, it won't bake it, and then you're going to have a problem because in the middle you'll have unbaked dough. Now, I'm sure that everybody here, when they've been a guest at someone's house, certainly your wife never does it, but as a guest, sometimes you'll go to a house and they'll serve you homemade challah, and you're looking forward to it, and it looks all crusty on the outside, and then they cut the challah, and when you cut the challah, there's dough in the inside. Sometimes it just didn't bake through and through. So just like when you're baking challah, challah is very thick. Sometimes in the inside you'll have dough that's not fully baked. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is if you have too thick dough that you're using for matzah, it could be that in the middle it's not going to bake. And that, if it's not baked, you now have chametz. So the Mishnah Berurah is concerned it's not going to bake on the inside, and we'll see in a minute that that was really the problem with soft matzahs. Rabbi Henkin talked about that. The Rabbi Henkin from New York, the grandfather of the current Rabbi Henkin, when he discussed using Ashkenazi ovens, Ashkenazi matzah ovens for Sephardi matzah. Then the Shari Chuvas is similar. He says, "B'pat of Pesach yoti b'tefach u'iti merabotai gonim shehayu goarim ma'od ba'osim ken lechatchila." So the Shari Chuvas says, I learned from my teachers that they would get very, very ma'od upset at people who would make thick matzah. Aval ein lasor b'diavad. If you did, it could be that it's permitted. It ain't near a shumayuta, as long as you don't see any problem with it. But again, the Shari Tshuva, Ashkenaz, 17th century, there were people baking thick matzahs. And his Rabbeim were not happy because we're in the period, 17th, 18th, 19th century, when we're getting thinner and thinner. And the Ramah says, V'yesh la'asot matzot rekikin. The Shulchan Aruch had said, don't make them too thick. Tefach is your limit. The Ramah comments and says, make them rekikin. V'lo pat aveh, but don't make it thick. Kishar lechem. And the Mishnah Berurah says, what's rekikim? Hainu after b'sivat the pochel mitafach muter. Mikol makom dachon yoter lechachil asot rekikin dakin. Mishnah Berurah says the ideal thin rekikin, because thin, as he explained, doesn't become chametz in the middle. You don't have to worry about that. And the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, wrote, Ein osin matzah aveh tefach k'shi aveh kol kach yesh lachu shema lo yishlot chom ha'esh b'tocha v'chametz b'tocha b'shat afyatav v'pocher b'tefach afilu mashu muter. He says, don't make it a tefach, but any little bit less than a tefach is just fine. U'mikol makom tov lasot ha'matzot rekikin dakin she'ein memar lahachim kol kach kamo avot k'shadayin hem if you make it thick, break it open and check inside to make sure that it's really well cooked. Okay, so that's regarding thick matzah. The only place where we find a real beautiful description of the history of matzah is again in a halacha, not related to how you bake matzah, but related to when you bake matzah. It might come as a surprise to some people that the ideal time to bake matzah was Erev Pesach after noon. Not only was that the ideal time, but according to many of the early Rishonim, that was the only time. The matzah that you used at the Seder, according to many of the Rishonim, had to be baked in the afternoon of Erev Pesach. Now, some women think this is an excuse for the men to get out of the house Erev Pesach. But actually, most of the baking of the matzah was done by the women, as we'll see in a minute. So the Tur, again, Tur is quoting his father. The Tur grew up in Spain, but his father, the Rush, came from Germany. And the Tur, now this is the Aruch HaShulchan. I just, rather than bring the Tur and then the whole history, the Aruch HaShulchan quotes it all. He says, Kosav HaTur, Ein matchilin letasek b'pat b'yudalin ad achavav shot. You can't start making your matzah until afternoon on Erev Pesach. And what's shocking, v'isa b'tshuva ma'isa be'echad she'afa kodem. There was a famous tshuva of some people who actually had the chutzpah to make their matzah on Erev Pesach in the morning. V'asu rabotenu hamatzot. And the authorities of the time prohibited it. He said, you cannot use that matzah for the Seder. The matzah at the Seder must be baked Erev Pesach afternoon. Now, there are people today who are makpid on that, and not too many, but that was the halacha for most of Jewish history. But now, the Aruch HaShulchan says, ma'od tamua data osrim. He says, I don't get it, to prohibit the matzah that was baked in the morning. But he goes on, he says, v'yote nirlan and the reason they gave while they prohibited it, they said you have to bake the matzah in the afternoon because the matzah is compared to the Korban Pesach, which was shechted in the afternoon of Pesach. The Aruch HaShulchan says, I don't go for that reason. He says, I know the halacha that the matzah is supposed to be made after noon on Erev Pesach. And I know that was the halacha for generations. Where did that come from? And he gives a novel explanation, which tells us a lot about the history of baking matzah. V'yote nir la'nir taiti, mishum dezeh yadua shebizman ha'kadmon lo hayu ofen kol ha'matzot kodem Pesach. He says in the old days, they didn't bake all the matzah way before Pesach. Today, the machine matzah that we buy they started baking at Hanukkah time. And the hand matzah that we buy, usually they started making around Tu B'Shvat. He says, it wasn't like that. Nobody made matzah before Pesach. Elahoyu ofim b'chol yom miyamei Pesach pat liyom zeh. You made fresh matzah. You had fresh bread. Who wants to eat stale bread from a month ago? You made fresh bread every day. Ad shator katav ledavar chidush. The Torah, when he moved from Germany to Spain, wrote as a novelty. He couldn't believe it. He said, Rosella shono va'ani re'iti beBarcelona. I came to Spain and I saw Barcelona. Those who were very careful in mitzvot, shayu ofim kol ma shetzrichim lemoed mikodem hamoed. They made all their matzah for all of Pesach before Pesach started. And why? She'im yitarevim o mashu michametz yitbatel kodem isuro ad kadashono. The Torah explains why were they baking all the matzah before Pesach? Because there's a halacha of bittul, that something could become nullified. And a little tiny bit of chametz in matzah before Pesach gets nullified. On Pesach, if you bake matzah on Pesach and a little tiny bit of chametz gets in, it's not nullified because there's no bittul of chametz on Pesach. So the Torah said that in Barcelona, they had this big chumrah that they instituted, that some people made all of their matzah before Pesach. That way they didn't have to worry. Bezeu Minich shalano, when he says this, and because of the davar chidush, he wrote it as a novelty. He says, but the Aruch HaShulchan says that's what we do. The Aruch HaShulchan, writing in the late 19th century Russia, says that's what we do. We make all of our matzah before Pesach. But now he explains, every day they had hot, fresh bread. So he said, what's the reason that they had to bake all of their matzah for the Seder in the afternoon? Is because what? It's going to be every day of the year you have fresh bread. Every day at Pesach you have fresh matzah. And for the Seder, you can have cold, stale matzah. That's a bizayon of the mitzvah. Therefore, why did they make all of the matzah Erev Pesach after Chatzot to have fresh matzah for the Seder? Because of the love of the mitzvah. But he says, he says, by us we bake everything before Pesach. There's no point in baking your matzah Erev Pesach after Chatzos. Nowadays, and most Jews never heard of such a business to make matzah Erev Pesach. So, but he explains the history. He says they used to make matzah every day. If you're making it every day, you can make it soft and you can make it fresh. But if you're going to make it before Pesach, you got to make sure that it's pre-staled. That's what we have. We have pre-staled matzah. You make it Hanukkah time, you pre-stale it, you make it soft and hard, and now it could last for a long time. Now, what's fascinating is how this minhag slowly spread. Today, it's nearly universal. We all have pre-staled matzah that was made before Pesach. How many people make matzah every day on Pesach? But that was a novelty, and it spread slowly. So I thought it was very interesting. If you look around, for example, in Salonika. Salonika is Sephardic, but it's not North African or Middle East, it's European Sephardic. And in the early 18th century, he says, "V'koch minhag Salonika, la'afot hakol kodem Pesach chama yomim." They already had the custom, you make everything a few days before Pesach. Ve'ein lashim b'toch Pesach chlal, ela b'shasat chak. Only if you get into an emergency, okay, make a little matzah on Pesach. Shlo ispik lo masha afak. If he doesn't have enough from when he made it ready. For example, v'chein nogim imchal sudat brit milah toch Pesach, sheyesh sham mesubin harbe. You end down with the brit during Pesach. Now I realized you had to know about it before Pesach because the brit is the 8th day. So you must have known before Pesach. But nonetheless, it could be the kid was born Erev Pesach or 2 days before Pesach. You made your matzah 3 or 4 days. He says, "Kama yamim," you don't have enough. So in Salonika, they did make everything before Pesach, but the bakeries were open on Pesach. There were still people who baked sometimes on Pesach. The only people who kept up the minhag of baking everyday fresh matzah were the Yemenites. And to this day, in the Yemenite communities around where I live in Beit Shemesh, they still bake matzah every day. And we've gone more than once to the Rav of the Moshav and baked with him on Chol HaMoed. But Rav Papa, who was sort of the chief rabbi of the Yemenites in Israel, mid-late 20th century, wrote about this. And he wrote, Katav Sabi, quotes his grandfather in one of his drashas. He says, what's the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov? Shabbos, you can't cook or bake. Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook or bake. And that's stated in the Torah by Pesach. It's only listed once. We have Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuos, Rosh Hashanah, but only by Pesach is where it's listed. Say his grandfather asked him, why is it mentioned only Pesach? And it's Af B'Shev Shalomar, Neshu Rishon. You could say, okay, Pesach is the beginning of the year. You could say that. That would be a parsimonious explanation. But he says, B'chol Zot, that's not the reason. Nitein Lomar, Galui V'yadui L'fnei Misha Amavoyo Olam. God knew, Sh'atidim Dorot Achronim La'achmir Chumrot Rabot B'Pesach, Ad Kedei L'Asot Afiyah L'Gamri. God knew that these Jews, they would get machmir and more machmir until they didn't bake any bread on Pesach. V'yoflu Pesach, and they would bake everything before. Kedeshim Yishchomesh Mashu, Yipatel, if there's man, etc. And what they would do, Pesach Lechem Nikudim, and they'd eat rotten bread on Pesach. The Fichach, Tzifta Torah Pesach, Ach Asher Yochal Lechol Nefesh. Hula Vado Yaseh Lechem. The heter of cooking and baking was stated by Pesach. Umikra Zeh, this Pasuk, his grandfather said, Einarak heter. It's not just that you're allowed. Eliyesh Bogam Tzivoy. It's a command. Lechol Lechem Cham B'chol Yom. You should have fresh bread. Okay. So that's about why we make pre-stale matzah all before Pesach. So far, everything we've looked at has related to the matzah itself. But I went looking, I wanted to see if we could find other sources that tell us about matzah, and that maybe will shed light on what the matzah looked like. And the only place I could really find is the halachas of Eruv. Now, Eruv, really, we usually think of as those strings that go around the town that allow us to carry on Shabbos. But that is really the Tuat HaPesach. What's an Eruv? An Eruv is after you have the strings or a wall or a fence all around, you now have to unite all of the people. And that was done, it's called an Eruv Chatzerot. And in the time of the Gemara, it was done by going house to house within the courtyard, collecting food from each person and putting it in one location. And that's as if all the people are now united as one large family. Today, the custom is that rather than going every Friday afternoon and collecting a little bit food from each person, we make an Erev Chatzerot once a year, an Erev Pesach, and the rabbi of the community takes a box of matzah or 2 boxes of matzah and makes the Erev. Now, the reason that works is because he can make an Erev Pesach with the matzah. The matzah is kosher Pesach, and our matzah, as we've discussed, is pre-staled, meaning it will last for a whole year because it has to remain edible for the Erev to be efficacious. The question is, how far back does that go? What's interesting is that the Machzor Vitri, which is from Talmidim of Rashi, 11th century, but it quotes almost verbatim an 8th century source, says, in Rosella Sot Erev Be'erev Pesach, L'chol Hashanah Kulo, Yitol hachacham kemach mikobayit ubayit v'yilosh v'yafeh uga achat or shtayim v'yaseh otam kashot shelo yirkavu v'yishiyu shmirot. He gives a great idea. He says, if you want to make an eruv that's going to last for the year, collect a little flour from each person, make it into one or two loaves, make them really hard so they won't rot, and that way it'll stay for the whole year. He does not call these hard loaves matzah, because this is not what their matzah was like. He doesn't say, okay, when you make your matzah for the Seder, take a few extra matzot and use them for the eruv. Because clearly, in the time of the Machzavitri, most of their matzahs were not pre-staled. So he tells you to take something unique. Make kosher Pesach, make it so it's not chametz, but it wasn't like the usual matzah. It was hard, and it would last for the year. And we see that this continued, this kind of thing. The Leket Yosha, who was 15th century Austria, tells us a story. Says, "Eruv Minich kahal hoya matzah shenasta al pi erev Pesach." They made matzah on erev Pesach, and he calls it matzah. They made it out of more than a kilo. They made a bigger hole in the center. So he describes, fascinating, but from the halakhic literature, you could really see stories. You see how they lived. You see history. He says they made a huge matzah. They would make a hole in the matzah and hang it in the Beis Medrash of the Truman Adeshin. And he says, and he explained, they are not the Beit Knesset, because they wanted to make it that it was a place where people live that was accessible. But from here you see that they made matzah, they called it matzah, and it was something that could last for the year. Now it's amazing, this idea of putting a hole and hanging it was very widespread. In Rome, they had a special matzah with all kinds of designs that they would hang as the eruv. And today there's no eruv in Rome, but they still do that. Every erev Pesach they hang a matzah. I don't know if Rabbi Jay remembers. I don't know if we were in the shul in India where we saw it. There was one shul we went to in India where these shuls were rebuilt by the government for tourists. And we came into one of the shuls and there was what looked like a matzah hanging there. And we asked the person taking us around, what is that? And he had no idea. He said, that's what we found. That's what we do when we rebuilt it. But it's clear that was their custom to hang the matzah. Now, the question that we had, and we'll see an answer in a minute, is that many of the customs of the Kochini Jews, this was in Cochin, we saw this, are from Yemen. Could it be that the Yemenite Jews were also doing this? We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, the Beit Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch says, Kosav Haran, Shoyu Ma'arvin B'chol Erev Shabbos V'erev L'chol Hashanah Eino Oseh. They, Beit Yosef said, it's called in the Ran, made an erev every erev Shabbos, not once a year. Shemiyat Apesh. Maybe it'll get moldy. He won't know about it, and that's a problem. But the Beit Yosef writes, he's writing around Tzfat, early 16th century. V'achshav nogim la'arev mishana l'shana. We make an erev for the whole year. V'lo chashin shemiyat Apesh, and we don't worry that it'll get moldy. Lefi she'osin osa matzah mitzuyeret. We make a designed matzah. V'talui ba'avir, and we hang it in the air. And it's not going to get moldy, says that way. Okay, you know what? We're going to skip the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah, and the Shulchan Aruch Harav on this, because I want to get to some Svarim here, the Me'am Loaves and the Rav Yosef Kapach. The Me'am Loaves, written in Istanbul, was written in Ladino. So the Hebrew and the English are both translations. I brought them both because they have a one-word difference that's of quite significance. We'll just read the English. Since it is very easy for people to forget to make the erev each Friday, it is customary for many people to make the erev on Friday before Pesach. So unlike what we've seen till now, they made an erev Pesach. They didn't make an erev Pesach. They made an erev Shabbat Hagadol for the entire year, using a matzah for this purpose. Meaning it's a matzah, a regular matzah, not something special like we saw in Machzavitri. Since the matzah does not spoil, the erev is valid for all year long. However, if the matzah becomes moldy, or was eaten by mice, then a new erev must be made. So he says, in general, the matzah doesn't become moldy, but he leaves open the possibility that it might. Meaning, his matzot weren't our matzot. I don't think our matzahs could become moldy. Now the difference there's a one-word difference. He says, yeah, He says, "L'chein nogel kachen matzah shel biyayin." He says in the Hebrew they would take matzah. There was, I don't know what that means, but okay. Now, the shocking point here is of Yosef Kapach. Back to Yosef Kapach, he wrote, "Ubeteman nahagu sharav ha'ir osem mishalo." He would take his own food, mezakel lecho bnei ha'ir. He would give it over to the people of the city. Ubechol hamoed shel Pesach hayu osinoto. So unlike in Turkey, where it's Erev Shabbat HaGadol, unlike in most of Europe, where it's Erev Pesach, there was Erev Shabbat Chol HaMoed, hayu ofinoto kama chalot ketanot shel matzah, umanichan oto bechalon gavo bebeit HaKnesset shel Rav, umachlifin oto kol shana. So now I was a little bit perplexed. There's no question that the Yemenites were using soft matzah. To this day, that's what they use in Israel. They bake it soft matzah, and yet Rav Kapach is telling us that their pita, their soft matzah, would last for the year, and they made the erev out of that soft matzah. How could that be? Well, at this point, the only thing to do was to do an experiment, right? Rabbi Jay mentioned I'm a scientist. We did an experiment. We took some pita, we put a hole in it, we hung it in our living room, dining room, hung it in the dining room, and we left it there for about 3 months. And indeed, if you hang even a pita, it doesn't get moldy. It dries out. And that pita very quickly dried. It became almost like, I don't know what you call those, like dry cracker. Talma, I forget what you call this, some kind of dry cracker. But it remains edible. And more than that, if you then take it down, we only did 3 months, but I suspect it's not changing if you leave it there for a year, and you dip it in soup or water, it becomes almost reconstituted, which explains why in some of the Achronim, they talk about, there was one case where if it's Erev Pesach Shechalios B'Shabbos, and now you have to make the new Erev, they would give it to the kids and dip it in liquid and give it to the kids to eat. So it turns out that this whole section, I was so clever, I thought. We could find out what kind of matzah people were using by looking at the halachot of Erev. And you could see, if they made an Erev for a whole year, clearly they're using hard matzah. If they made an Erev only from Shabbos to Shabbos, clearly they're using soft matzah. Clearly, my hypothesis was wrong. Because even in Yemen, soft matzah, and yet they make it for a year. So I think the only thing we could tell about matzah from the laws of Erev is if they called it matzah or if they made something special. So there's no question, 11th century France, they were using soft matzah and something that wouldn't last for a year. But there's no question that by the time of the Shulchan Aruch, they have the concept of hard matzah already. And the fact that they're using it for an Erev doesn't prove, though, that it was soft. Okay, now I want to go back to something that we saw up above, when we talked about thick versus thin, and he mentioned that for the matzah that you're going to grind, you can make it a little bit thicker. And what was that talking about? So in the Shari Tshuva, and you see here, very early 19th century Poland, he says, see, here's the concern that he has. We know that we eat a lot of matzah on Pesach, and you make all kinds of things out of matzah, and you can make matzah brai and matzah pizza, but there's a limit to what you can make out of the matzah itself. So what's commonly done is you grind it and you make matzah meal. And from the matzah meal, you could then make lots of other cakes and bagels and other things. It seems that in the 1700s and the 1800s, some of the Amaratzim didn't understand that the matzah meal that was being used was ground matzah and it wasn't raw flour. And this became a concern that some people were worried maybe you shouldn't be able to use matzah meal because other people would get mixed up and think you're using flour. So he says, "B'medinatenu ein choshun lezeh shekol isha yodat shekemach shemishtamishim bo b'Pesach im matzah afuya u'katusha." It's baked matzah that was ground, or tchina, or that was katush is how do you say it? With a mortar and pestle. Or tchina, always ground. Rak shesh anshe ma'isa shemachmirim al atzman ve'en ochim shum matzah shuya. There are people who don't eat gebrucht, and therefore they don't use that stuff. V'alko ponim near the afa machmir mihai taima ein tzorch la hachmir shlolit bol matzah afuya. He says you could certainly dunk matzah because because at that point they can't become chametz. He says, "V'habei mekilim b'chol inyan, v'sfir she'ein lachush lezeh, v'gam nir shetchilas chumar zeh." Where did the chumar of gebrucht come from? It says, "Yotzim yimashoyin nogim mikedem lasos al pesach matzot avot harbei." He says, in the old days, they used to make very thick matzahs. Af shloya k'shir tefach. They weren't like we said a tefach, but they were thick. Michol makom hayo avot harbei. Umehem hayu osim hakefach lepesach al yedei grira beribaisen. They used to take the thick matzah and they would rub it on a ribaisen. I don't know what you call a grinder. So my grandmother had to ground the grain. So they used to grind it on a ribaisen, this thick, hard matzah. So now we understand why they were making thick and hard. Because today we buy matzah meal in the store. It's ground in the factory. But back then there was nothing in the factory. You made all your own matzah at home. Now you wanted to make matzah meal. How are you going to make matzah meal? So if you're going to take soft matzah, very hard to grind. If you're going to take really thin, hard matzah, also hard to grind. If you have hard, thicker matzah and you have a ribaisen, you could grind it on the ribaisen. And therefore, this is very common. On those thick ones, you would sometimes find not baked dough on the inside. But his point is that they would make the thick matzah not to eat, but they would make the thick matzah in order to make matzah flour, ground matzah. And the Chassam Sofer talks about that also. He says, he's talking about that a new type of grain he was discussing in his tshuva. Says, for this new flour, matzah shel matzot, he says you can't make matzah from this new stuff. So don't make it rikikin, because the rikikin, the very thin matzah, is what you would use for the Seder. Ki'im avim, make thick ones, kamosha karam rib matzahs. They would call the thick matzahs rib matzahs because those were ground on the ribaisen. But if rib matzahs as soon became a chitin, then you could have a problem. So the Chassam Sofer is very clear. There were two types of matzahs. You had rib matzahs, thick matzahs that you could grind, and you had rikikin, which are the thin matzahs that you used to make the matzah, the kamach matzah. And indeed, the Adnei Paz talks about that as well. And then what's really fascinating, Jay, can I have share back? Okay, let me share something else.
I never took the share away. You should still be able to.
Okay, great. I see it now. Where is it?
It was working till about 10 seconds.
No. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, I'm not finding the item to share. Hold on.
It should share anything on your computer screen, and then you have to choose the item.
Yeah, hold on. We got it right here. Okay, do you see now?
It's coming, yeah.
Okay, it's from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. This is from 1853. I can send this to you afterwards. It's very hard to read on the screen. It's very hard to read b'chlal. The one I have also is not great quality, but hold on. It's fascinating. Frank Leslie's was an illustrated newspaper in New York in the mid-19th century, and they had somebody who they sent to go write about what the Jews were doing, what Passover was all about. Anyone taking a morning walk through Gotham Street will meet enough men whose low stature, shining black eyes, crisp, inky hair, hooked nose, stooping shoulders, and eager movements proclaim that of them of the Hebrew race, to convince them that Jews are prevalent in our city in large numbers. Okay, so this is how he starts. This is how he describes that, there were a lot of Jews, and then he writes about the matzahs that they were making. And the matzahs that they were making are described like this. He says there were some of them are about 1/8 of an inch. You see it again? You see the sources?
We do. We see the sources, yes.
Some of them are about 1/8 of an inch thick and are rather slack baked, being a very light color. Another variety is about twice or 3 times as thick and is baked much browner. Now we understand what's going on. They're really thick ones, the ones that are 2 or 3 times as thick and then much browner. Those are the ones that are being used to make that you're doing on the ribeyes in it. And the lighter ones and the thinner ones, that's what they were eating. Okay, just to point out so the question now is, how about Ashkenazim? Could Ashkenazim eat these matzahs? So first of all, as I mentioned, the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva says, "Lo kol anashim v'lo kol la'etzim v'lo kol la'tanurim shavim." Every time you bake, it's going to be a little different depending on the wood, the oven, the women, who, as we see, did all the baking. And Yosef Eliyahu Henkin pointed out, he says that you have to be very careful when you're baking the thin matzahs, the thick matzahs. He says, in order to make sure you don't get chametz, you have to use a lower temperature oven. Because if you use a higher temperature oven, what's going to happen? The surfaces are going to brown and the inside is not going to get baked. So he very wisely talked about not using an Ashkenazi oven, because the Ashkenazi ovens today are exceedingly hot. We have very, very thin matzah, very dry batter. You put it in the oven, and in some of those hand factories, it could be 30 or 45 seconds, and it's baked and out of the oven. In a Sephardi oven, you're not going to do that. Thick Sephardi matzah, soft matzah, is going to take longer to bake. So he says you don't want to put it in such a hot oven. Very important point. Led to some real problems a few years ago when they started selling commercial soft matzah in Israel. Because what happened is, until a few years ago, you couldn't sell commercial soft matzah. Because soft matzah had to be baked fresh. Like we saw at the very beginning, you put it in the box, you put other soft matzah on top of it, it's going to get moldy. What happened? They realized you could bake it a month before Pesach and freeze it. And then when you buy it to take it home, you put it into the freezer, and you take it out an hour or so before the Seder, you put it on the platter, and you have, again, fresh soft matzah. So in the last few years, they've started making commercial soft matzah in Israel. But the problem was, early on when they did that, they were using Ashkenazi factories. And in my opinion, at least, some of those matzahs were very problematic. Now, just the only other place you could get description of what matzah looked like is from a tourist. Because as I said, we don't have description of matzah. Everybody knows what matzah looks like. But if you're a tourist in a place where they have different type of matzah, you will describe it. So for example, the Evan Sapir of Yaakov Sapir, mid-19th century, he grew up in Yerushalayim. He was a Shadar, a Shlicha Derabanan. He was sent to raise money. Now, mid-19th century, if you need to raise money for the Jerusalem community, I would think you would go to Paris, you'd go to Vienna. But Rav Yaakov Sapir was more interesting. And he went to India, Yemen, Australia, New Zealand. And thankfully for us, he wrote a travelogue. And he has left us amazing descriptions of the Jewish communities of Australia, New Zealand, India, and Yemen from the mid-19th century. And he tells us that when he was in Yemen for Pesach, the rabbi there, Rabbi Chia Kara, said to him, "Echol itano matzot chama, eat with us hot matzah, hanafet b'chol yom, that's baked fresh daily, k'mineg avotenu, like our ancestors have always done. Al tedaga la kashrut, don't worry about the kashrut. Just because they're not dried and old 30 days like yours. Other sages from Yerushalayim have been there. Our women, they know how to make matzahs. Every day we have fresh, hot matzah. And oneg yontif is only with fresh bread. But not only shlosha matzot rakot v'nekiot. And he gave me 3 clean, soft matzahs. That's 1854. 1910, Yontif Samach, a representative of the joint, who grew up in Turkey, went to visit. And he gives an amazing description. He says, I went to the kitchen to see how they make matzah. The woman is sitting on the ground. She's shaking an earthenware bowl full of water. She smacks on the wall of the hot oven. And after just a moment, she takes beautiful bread, matzah. It inspires hunger. What is the world of difference between these matzahs, the hard, heavy matzot, that are impossible to digest, that we make in Turkey. They make it twice a day. With such emphasis on the making it kosher. Honam, however, tires out the woman. Anyhow, what's the life of a woman in Yemen? No not misery and work. Okay, so now the question is, can Ashkenazim use the soft matzah that they're selling today, assuming they've gotten the ovens correct? Again, not a trivial matter. It seemed to me that was the bigger concern, was how they were making the matzah. But there are a few different opinions. Rav Dov Lior writes, someone asked him that, whatever, just the tshuva, Yehudi Ashkenaz, there are already a few generations that us Ashkenazim eat only thin and dry. You yourself is the Sfari Yochel Lekach and Mashat Ragil, Ach Hamesuba Macherem Lo Roy Shishanu Minach. Rav Dov Lior says Ashkenazim should stick Ashkenazi practice. Rav Shmuel Aliyahu, of course, is Sfari. That's quite different. He says, it's not a minhag. And there's some who don't. You could eat what you want. There's no reason not to. Rav Osher Weiss, in his Haggadah, has a long description of the history, and the Ashkenazim also used to have thick soft. Then he basically says the minhag is to have the thin, and it was started because of a halachic concern of chimutz in the middle, and he says, in Pesach we should take any chumrah that we can so we don't get chumutz, and so he says not to eat a soft matzah. However, one last opinion. Wait, hold on, actually. Let's go. Hold on. Nope, not that. One last opinion is a tshuva of Rav Shechter, and this, as you could see, was written 9 years ago. And Rav Shechter, this is legible, unlike the Frank Leslie's. But basically, what he says at the end, he says you have minhagim, and then you have details on the minhag. He said there's a minute to have a perochet on the Aron Kodesh. If you happen to have a red one, and now we're going to switch to a green one, that's not changing the minhag. The minhag is to have a perochet. He says the din is to have matzah. There's no minhag in what kind of matzah. And therefore, he says, as far as he's concerned, as long as it's kosher Pesach, there's no problem in Ashkenazi having soft matzah. So, and I think that's it. So again, just to summarize the history, it seems very clear that in the old days, the matzah was thick and or softer, but throughout the history, they became thinner and harder, mostly for halachic concern, probably also for a commercial concern. When the population densities became higher, and it became much harder, people weren't baking their own. So you had to have commercial factories. A commercial factory is not going to be able to make enough for the whole city of Warsaw on Erev Pesach. They started baking in advance. But also, as we saw in the Aruch HaShulchan, it was for halachic reasons, so that you can bake everything before Pesach. If you're baking everything before Pesach, there's no way that you could have it without having it pre-staled. So it seems that for halachic reasons is why they started making it soft and thin. Regarding the matzah today, as I said, it seems to me the biggest concern with the soft matzah is it really baked the way they were baking it in the old days? There's no question that there are Yemenites today who know how to bake it, who have the tradition. As I said, when I've gone to the Moshavim and baked with them in Cholamoid, they bake it in a tabuna. They know how to bake it. There's an Iraqi bakery in Yerushalayim that's open one night a year, an Erev Pesach, and all the good Iraqis in Israel know to come there and get their fresh matzah. And there also, it's baked on Erev Pesach on the side of the oven on the tabun. They have a family tradition. You open it up and it's not doughy on the inside. Is there a question of changing your family tradition if you're an Ashkenazi? Well, as we saw of Dov Lior and of Usher Weiss think yes. I guess each person could ask their posik. Okay, if there are questions.
There are a few on the chat box. All right, there are just a couple of questions there if you want to take a quick look.
Okay. Hold on. I lost the chat box.
Go up here.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Let's see if. Okay.
If you don't have it, I'm happy to read your questions.
Yeah, the Zayt
That was me. I was just telling you that the Zayt used to be a lot smaller.
Well, but it still was a Zayt. You still, if you're using an Isaron, you can get many Zaytim out of it. And from ours today, even if you use a smaller Zayt, Yesh Gvul, you're not going to be able to get enough for your Seder. You have 10, 15 people for one matzah, you're not getting a Zayt out of it, even if you use a smaller shear.
I'll tell you a cute story if I may. Rav Schachter, when I was in a shear many years ago, told us that his father-in-law, who was a Rebbe in one of the great yeshivas, I don't remember where, his father-in-law had mentioned to him that they had a Seder once, 5 Rosh Yeshivas were there, and they ate one matzah between the 5. Just because the Kazai, as a Kazai, just, okay. Anyway, go.
Yeah. Somebody asked, what do you do in Erev Pesach Shabbos? Excellent question. Most of the literature about baking on Erev Pesach after Chatzot is actually in the sources that talk about what to do when it's Erev Pesach Shabbos, because in general, there was nothing to talk about. Everybody knew you baked your matzah Erev Pesach after Chatzot. So there was a big machloket. Either you baked it in Motzei Shabbat, or you baked it Erev Shabbat. Obviously, you didn't bake it on Shabbat, but there was no unified opinion. Some baked it Erev Shabbos, some baked it Motzei Shabbos. Obviously, if you hold like the Aruch HaShulchan, that the point is to have fresh matzah, baking it Erev Shabbos doesn't really help. If you thought it had to do with a link to the Korban Pesach, then maybe it would make sense to bake it before. Next year, indeed, Erev Pesach is going to be on Shabbat. For many, many years, I've been zoichet to have Erev Pesach matzah on the Seder. This year, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to. And Mir Hashem, next year again, we'll be able to. So somebody has said that the matzah that was put aside for Ne'ev had become green because it got wet. That's a problem if it becomes wet. Like I said, they would hang the matzahs, and then it wasn't a problem. Our matzahs won't get moldy as long as it stays dry. I don't know of any rabbi that actually checks them to make sure that they haven't gotten moldy, but it is a real concern. Right, Rabbi Eisen is a grader. Thanks for the translation. Okay. Can the sources be shared? Sure, but even better than, I could share them. All of this is found in 2 articles that I wrote. They should both be available for free online. I have one article that was in Chakira. I wish I could tell you what year. I'll send it to Jay. It was an article in Chakira. All of Chakira articles are available free online, except for the most recent issue. And the other was in the RJJ, Journal of Halacha Contemporary Society. I think both of them were about 6 years ago, but I could send you those PDFs.
Send it to me. That's like we can post them.
Okay. Why are Ashkenazim worried about having non-tasty matzah? Yeah. Well, first of all, some people get used to matzah. Some people think matzah, but they were more concerned with the concern that it should become chametz. And what's interesting is, I didn't bring the whole Shari Tshuva. There's a very long Shari Tshuva about Gebrucht. And in that Tshuva, he explains where the Minich of Gebrucht came from. And then he tells why some people aren't makpid. And in a beautiful way of Elu V'Elu, he says that everybody really is concerned l'shem shamayim. These are concerned for the chashash of chametz, and these are concerned for the chashash of simchas yontif. Those who eat Gebrucht want to have simchas yontif, and those that don't eat Gebrucht are more concerned about the chametz. So, okay. Rav Shechter's tshuva I could post. I think it's online actually already. I don't know where I pulled it off. He sent it to us, but he also I don't have the URL. He had it online someplace also, but I could send you that, sure. Okay,